Hi, Shalini. Welcome to the third 319 Climate Innovating Climate Conversation.
Hey
I'm just
there.
going to, well, great to see you. I'm just going to do an introduction for you, and then we'll get into it. So, just introducing you, Shalini Vajjhala, Executive Director of Pre-Collective, a
Mhm.
public service-minded infrastructure and project development experts focused on helping communities make the most of transformational infrastructure opportunities. You're also the co-founder of Refocus Partners, an organization dedicated to developing resilient and sustainable infrastructure solutions. You trained initially as an architect, transitioning through a master's in public and engineering and public policy, to a PhD in the same subject area, all through Carnegie Mellon University. Go Tartans. You started out as an early career architect and then did community activation work in communities from Pennsylvania to Southern Africa, excuse me.
Mhm.
And then following work at Resources for the Future, you served in senior roles with the Obama administration, including as special rep for urban and sustainability and as deputy assistant administrator at the EPA. Shalini, you're an influential leader in the fields of climate resilience, sustainable infrastructure, and environmental policy. You always bring expertise and innovative thinking to help communities and organizations address the complex challenges of climate change. And I can't wait to talk to you about driving impactful, scalable solutions to build a more resilient future. So, welcome to the climate conversation. How are you?
I'm doing well, Rob. Thanks for having me.
No, look, of course, of course. And did I characterize you right there? I mean, there's a lot of other things I could have said about you, of course.
That was a lovely introduction.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, look, I ask all of my guests the same question at the beginning, and the question is, what drives you to innovate?
Oh, what a great way to start a conversation. I think my main drivers of innovation are listening close to the ground, and I think it's what's carried my career on sort of this odd, clear in hindsight career path from architecture to policy to financing. But I started out in my very early work studying abroad in architecture school, trying to understand why people lived in precarious places in megacities. And so, for communities that were 2 inches from a railway line, with their homes being torn down for new railway construction, why would they choose to move back to that same spot when they were being offered housing outside the city? And so I started using tools like community mapping just to ask questions and assume that people were making rational decisions, right? You have to assume people are acting in their own self-interest. And when you start peeling that back, you get all sorts of interesting answers and you find that people are basically motivated by the same things, which is access to opportunity, security, well-being. And so I started out as an architect in this very site specific, close to the ground work, and found that when you ask people why they live somewhere, it is equally easy to ask when they say, not in my backyard. How big's your backyard? What's in, what's out?
Mm,
What does that mean for siting infrastructure? And so that very quickly led me from, community building design all the way out to siting large scale infrastructure and how do we pay for it in the public interest.
hmm. Oh, that's really interesting. So it's that sense of starting with people, listening to concerns, and then thinking of scale and context. Right? Is that what
Exactly.
I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. Um, so one of the things that I really admire about you is just how clear you are in your intent. I mean, you just really hit the nail on the head there about, in my view, but just in the way that you speak about your work and think about the impact that you can make as a professional in this field. How do you think about that?
Um, we do really think about this a lot. So it's a high priority for our team to keep the main thing the main thing. And right now, how I would characterize that in our work is that everything we do is focused on helping people do what they need most next rather than defaulting to the familiar and what they have. So rather than putting band-aids on our existing infrastructure, how do we enable these brave and somewhat harder transitions into an uncertain future and make it straightforward to do that? And so I think it's it's a laser focus on this kind of transition, having a vision for what you need next, having the skills and the capacity to get there, and then making sure the money follows.
Yeah, so it's breaking. I mean, how do you then actually conceptualize that? Because that is the default, is it right? We've seen the past, so we imagine the future as being like that, a little bit different. I mean, how do you actually work with clients to think about that? Do you use other analogies? Do you take them different places physically, or how do you do that?
I live in metaphor, which challenges my team daily, but I think I compare our work in climate resilience to two different fields, and their parallels are very strong, one of which is early childhood education, where if I think about our work in climate resilience, oftentimes success is something that doesn't happen, right? So we all know the storm hit, but the community wasn't devastated.
Right.
That's an ideal outcome. The first year that happens, everybody applauds. Everybody remembers the storm. The second year it happens, your budget gets cut. And the third year, your staff go away. And then the fourth year, the storm hits again. And we repeat this awful cycle. And so this approach to success being something that doesn't happen takes a lot of discipline, like back to the clear intent, right up front to say, this is the future we are working toward and investing in, and here's what it looks like at each stage. So you never forget that you're still on the path to success, even when it might not seem like anything's happening. And so the two parallels that I find most helpful are early childhood education and preventative health care. Because in both of those cases, you're talking about global benefits from early action, really strong positive outcomes and negative outcomes avoided.
Right.
And it's the difference between being in the emergency room and taking the time up front to prevent that bad outcome.
Right. Yeah, this is this damage avoided, damage costs avoided, right? And then to be able to think that through about how decision makers and decision shapers will feel at that point. I often find, we were talking about that at the top. I mean, in group settings, to actually not ask all the time just the what and the why, but how would you feel about that? And that kicks in that sense, doesn't it, of personal, of safety, of envisaging a future and so on. I mean, is that what you find?
Yeah, we oftentimes when's the last time this happened? When did you see this? When did you experience a success? How did it feel? And so we actually do that with a pair of questions, Rob, that I use so consistently it's now become a bedrock of our work. And we'll ask two questions. One is, well, who loses money if we don't do something here? And the second question is the real kicker. It's who suffers if we don't get this right? And how do you know? When's the last time you felt that? What did it look like? What was the trickle-down effect when people couldn't leave mobile homes when it was really hot out? Or when there was a major hurricane? And that's where I think you get people down into the experience of decision-making, not just the idea of making a decision.
Right. Yeah, the lived reality, right? And then to be able to share that for purposes of scaling. I mean, I was looking at your website earlier today, and the work of Pre-Collective. I just wanted to ask you about that, because you've got some great case studies there. You've got some great stories of individuals talking about that. But what motivated you then to shift from your work at Refocus Partners then to leading Pre-Collective, and how do those missions align?
Yeah, so I'll walk a little bit from my work as an architect. I spent several years in federal government, where I think what I realized that the federal government was really, at the time that I was in the Obama administration, really trying to motivate investments in green infrastructure. But a lot of it came down to local governments. How do you think about planning to remake your water system? Turn your city from a funnel into a sponge. And we didn't have the tools for doing that, right? You can't enforce a street tree. You want to be able to help implement these things that were a lot more pieces and parts than old infrastructure systems that we were used to dealing with, right? A single water treatment plant versus 1,000 street trees or more. And so what motivated my shift from federal work to local work was this recognition that we really needed to get close to the ground and create precedents, not just pilots, for how to do resilience work. What does success look like in practice? So I'm back to that, the avoided loss, right? You had to show it. Mm-hmm. And so after 10 years of design work and really focusing in on project design and finance put together, so how do you make sure that the money is part of the design conversation early enough that you don't have a project on the drawing board you can never pay for? And so we did a decade worth of very cool project work with cities, with organizations like the World Bank, all across the world. And over the last 3 years, with massive shifts in US policy around infrastructure, around climate funding and financing, we realized we needed to step even further upstream. A big part of our work has always been in this kind of wonky space that's called pre-development. It's all the early messy stuff you have to do to know what you actually want to build next instead of just fixing what you have. And we decided to lean fully into that space because we were watching this massive influx of money with a real sense of opportunity to do transformational things, but not a lot of support for local governments and communities to know how to start. And so Pre-Collective was, I think the metaphor that I use is like running a relay race, where before we were helping, set a finish line and guiding runners to that finish line to get projects done. And now we're helping really get organized on all these different relay races all across the country for local governments that need to say, completely rethink their water systems or climate action at a regional scale versus at a building scale. And so it's been enormously rewarding. And we, in that process, shifted from a social business in Refocus, a design firm, to a nonprofit in Pre-Collective.
That's wonderful. And I've heard you speak about shovel-worthy, I think, rather than shovel-ready. Do you want to just pick at that? Because I just love that term.
Yeah, I think I have to credit folks, I think maybe an accelerator for America for the shovel-worthy term. This might actually be Mayor Pete or Secretary Pete Buttigieg now. But it's really the difference between having some off-the-shelf drawing for something you wanted to build 10 years ago that just got stuck, that you dust off and make modern, versus saying, what do we actually need now and next? And that's where I think the huge opportunities are, is being able to move efficiently in that space of saying what you need next, rather than it taking 3 years to come up with design ideas that then by the time you're done, the money is dried up. And so that's where pre-development really matters. It has to be equitable and efficient. And those two things are pretty rare together.
Oh, wonderful. So just extending that a little bit, I mean, in terms of thinking of financing mechanisms, innovative financing mechanisms, you touched on this at the beginning. So can you just talk a little bit about where your work is at and where you think the space is at more broadly around resilience bonds, other innovative financing tools that you've helped to fund resilience infrastructure projects?
Yeah, I love this question, Rob, because I think the response I've evolved over the last 10 years is really counterintuitive. So when I started this work, it was very much with the mindset of, when we are successful in designing a resilient infrastructure, just a piece of infrastructure, say a flood protection, if you do it right, you're avoiding these losses. You're creating value, you're creating savings. And capturing those savings sometimes is obvious and sometimes is not, right? So that goes to that question of who loses money when we don't get this right.
Yeah, who suffers?
And yeah, exactly. And one of the things we realized in our very early work was we were designing public sector infrastructure projects that were creating private sector value. There were insurance companies that were going to lose less money when public assets and private assets were both better protected behind a coastal protection or with a flood protection project. And so we spent a lot of time saying, well, could we actually model that financial value? So you take a project, you say, okay, here's what the world looks like without the project, and here's what it looks like with the project. And here's the difference, the delta in the financial losses. And so you're basically just taking a curve of projected losses and pushing it down. So this is the equivalent of, you have life insurance, you quit smoking and your rates go down. You have lowered a risk in a way that's measurable across a whole population. This is really tough to do in a project by project basis, right? We know how to do this for an entire population where you can look at smokers and non-smokers across hundreds of millions of people.
Right.
We haven't built a lot of resilient infrastructure and we haven't modeled it. And so this is a very different exercise, but we approached this from the perspective of projects we were designing, where we knew the nuts and bolts, we knew the people, and we could really dig in. And so we spent several years with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, working with partners across the insurance sector, in the engineering sector, and then with communities that were building these pieces of infrastructure. And we ended up creating a mechanism that was a variation on a catastrophe bond, which for folks who aren't deep in this finance space, I kind of want you to think about it like a life insurance policy for cities. It pays out when something terrible that you have anticipated happens. Hurricane hits within a certain wind speed, for example. These bonds are designed to be adjusted. So say you add a new building, a luxury apartment tower, right? You can adjust the bond to cover that extra value that you've created that needs to be protected. So what we realized is you should be able to do this in the other direction too. If you reduce the risk, you should be able to adjust the cost down for the holder of the bond. And that's the basic logic behind a resilience bond, was you can actually say, just like life insurance policy quit smoking, for certain types of risk reductions, you can do the same thing. What we found is that after designing this fancy financial mechanism, we found that almost everyone who approached us to use one of these things had much lower hanging fruit. And so this was, I think, the greatest surprise to me about 6 or 7 years into this work, is that a lot of public entities would come and say, yes, we would like to explore this type of insurance solution. And then you would realize that the right hand and the left hand of, say, a transit authority weren't really talking to each other. And so transit authorities, I'm going to pick on them because I think they are the tip of the spear for impacts on large systems where there is a closed loop financing innovation that's possible, but they're not having the conversation with themselves. It's easier to talk to someone outside. So picture any large subway rail system in a major metropolitan city. Could be Perth, could be Chicago, could be DC, could be LA.
Right.
And all of them have a common problem, which is when it's really, really hot out for multiple days in a row, you have system failures. I mean, frankly, things melt. They just get really hot and the system doesn't function well. So one of the things that you do to manage risk is that you run fewer trains and you run them more slowly. So I want you to picture a hot track that could melt or deform or derail a train. You're just not going to use it as often. You're going to try to minimize pressure on the system. So you're losing revenues on that side. So that's the who's losing money. On the flip side, if you ask who's suffering, that's your riders that you've left out in the heat longer on the hottest days of the year. Right. So this is where innovative financing, it didn't take a massive leap to an insurance instrument. What it takes is a look at your balance sheet to say, where am I losing money? What's getting unaffordable? and where am I interrupting my basic services and my mission? And so we found ways to pay for projects much more simply, long before we ever found our way into needing to use resilience bonds. And that was a real surprise for me, that I think people were looking for a silver bullet, and it's easier to look outside than inside, but it became an entry point for innovative financing, in the sense that innovation is getting things done and moving money in a direction toward resilience. And that, I think, has been a real lesson and a theme for our work in Pre-Collective.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it's almost like, I have hammer, find me nail, rather than I actually have an objective here of building, or what. I'm not as good with analogies and metaphors as you are, but
it's a decade of practice.
Right. Well, I think it's a good one though, because it's actually about having those, like you were saying, actually having the conversations about what's the purpose of the work that you want to achieve.
Exactly.
What is the most efficient spend, your adaptation or resilience spend, for the outcomes, for the broader societal outcomes, and for your organizational outcomes too. And I should just say, just recording some work I did many years ago on this very topic with Los Angeles Metro, actually. And and one of the, particularly in extreme heat, of course, is the impact on bus drivers. Actually, there's a big health and safety component as well. And like you were saying, I mean, this broader economic impact too of those that need transit for work, and just how that resonates through the broader economy. That is really, really interesting. And so just to segue that a little bit more into the community-centered design that the work that you've done. I mean, you've touched on this a couple of times, but I just want to draw that out a little bit, of actually how you approach those unique community needs, especially those that are particularly vulnerable or underserved.
I think this connects directly to that who's suffering piece of your work with LA Metro, the example I just gave. And I think how we approach community-centered design is we ask lots of questions of lots of people, and we really try to walk in one direction, which is from needs to ideas to projects to money. We try in every case possible to avoid reverse engineering needs from money. And I think that's so common in our world today, right? It's I have this financial instrument, I have this fund, I have this federal pot of money that I need to spend, and then you walk backward into the needs. Whereas if you ask people what they need, I think you get such sophisticated answers from people on the ground. It goes back to my very early infrastructure siting and informal communities along railways, in Egypt and India and Brazil. They had deeply sophisticated answers about what they needed and why they were where they were. And the same is true now, where if you go to a community and say, we have EV chargers, you'll get a reaction, but you won't get a need, right? If you go to a community and say, what do you need, and does this meet that need, you get really fantastic responses of like, you can't put a charger there because the streetlights are all broken. Can you fix the streetlights? Can you make this area safer while you bring this amenity? And I think that kind of yes and approach to infrastructure is one that we need to get a lot better at, rather than, I think, hand-waving a little bit about trying to make people feel heard. I think we need to actually listen. And it's a really important part of the process that is early enough, that is not well funded, but it is again, back to preventative health and early childhood education. You immediately see the failure when it wasn't done early, right? It's the project that never happened, or the thing that took an extra year or cost twice as much. And so that's really why we lean in to community-centered design early. It's good business sense.
It also takes humility too. I think you perhaps
constantly.
Yeah, but I I see you for that. I guess that's what I'm
Thank you.
saying.
Yeah.
That there are many others of like me expert, you whatever,
Mm-hmm.
lesser than
Mm.
that, rather than we're in a
Yeah.
conversation together. How can we work together to affect positive change? And I think you are particularly good at that. So I just
Well, thank you.
wanted to reflect that. Hey, look, I just want to move on and actually just think about that in terms of
Mm-hmm.
success. One of the criticisms there you talked about, I thought very
Mm-hmm.
well about damage costs avoided and being able to monetize that. But in terms of actually measuring success, particularly this avoided losses,
Mm-hmm.
how do you then actually characterize that in a positive way?
I think there are a number of ways to do it. I'm going to start with one way that I don't do it, and then we can talk about the specific ways to do it. I think one thing that adaptation professionals kind of fell into very early because our work touches so many different things is that we've often done a lot of hand waving about the multiple benefits of doing adaptation projects. And so instead of measuring success, there is a lot of general describing of co-benefits or multiple benefits. And I find that that is not nearly as compelling as breaking things down into benefits and beneficiaries. I'm belaboring that and because I
Mm,
think it is something that is so easily left behind. We oftentimes will take a project, it doesn't matter, fire resilience, flood resilience, housing infill, you name it, right? Anything that you could think of. And we will talk about the benefits of the project, but we will never say who the beneficiary is. And this is where I think success really becomes salient is when I think about our work, one of our signature projects was with folks in the city of Hoboken after Hurricane Sandy. And this is a tiny city that did an amazing thing, which is, after being 12 feet underwater, they designed an absolute crown jewel of a 6-acre resilience park. And we helped them think about multiple successes. So instead of buying flood pumps, which was the first and reasonable reaction to being in such dire circumstances, they, over the course of several years, cleaned up a contaminated site and built a beautiful layer cake and bathtub to hold floodwater. And that layer cake provided green space and parks and amenities that the city had never had before in any scale. And that's what success looks like, right? It's showing what you can do for lots of different people, not just this preventing one bad thing far into the future. It's the present value of these investments that needs to be put together. And I think this applies to mitigation also, right? No one eats an emissions reduction. It's where it connects to a healthy building or a
right,
safer street.
right.
And so that's to me how we measure that success is how do you take that present value and connect it to who it creates value for.
Hmm. Oh, that's really interesting. I met the mayor of Hoboken at COP last year, and his team.
He's fantastic.
Real
Yeah, Mayor
leaders.
Bob. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, okay. Look. Let's think about the future from here.
Yeah.
What emerging trends are you seeing in the space of resilient infrastructure development?
Oh, I'm excited about this, Rob. I think a couple things. So at Pre-Collective, we have a very large portfolio of work right now, working with green banks across the country. And there's such an interesting catalytic moment to be able to look at resilient infrastructure at the system level rather than just at the project level, which I think dominated certainly my work over the last decade. And now we're getting to these spaces where when you ask who's losing money and who's suffering, we actually have more space to answer that question at larger scales. So, one of the trends I'm most excited about is weirdly the sophistication that's developed around supply chains coming out of 2020
Hmm.
and COVID-19 supply chain disruptions. And the reason is that we have whole new attention and data to that question of who's losing money, which is private companies, supply chains being disrupted by natural disasters and damages to public infrastructure. So I want you to picture, I just said that in a very abstract way, I want you to picture a railway line underwater where 25 Fortune 500 companies are now paying extra to go around that flood, are now rearranging their logistics, their operations, dealing with the cost of delays, dealing with the human cost of that. That's your tired bus drivers in the heat, right? And so I think the trends around supply chain resilience are going to really reshape how the private sector has financial interest in public sector assets. Things that are deeply unsexy otherwise.
That's really interesting that you say that. I mean, I think too that the climate risk disclosure space is also going to be a driver for this. Here in California, as you know, Senate Bill 261 is slated for implementation soon, and that's going to be requiring companies to actually think about these issues, and then coming out the other side from that, recognizing the value of public infrastructure resilience and so on, and then building sort of beneficial circles out of that. That's really interesting. I wasn't expecting you to go into supply chain resilience. That was really insightful. Thank you. Look,
Can I add one more thing on that,
Go ahead.
just so we can open the door to future collaborations?
Yeah.
I think this disclosure space is fascinating for where it will reveal the opportunities for collective action. And there haven't been a lot of drivers for that, with information being really closely held. I think we're seeing the insurance sector get better at this in the collective interest, and it's led to institutions that, like the Institute for Building and Home Safety, which is insurance sector funded in the collective interest of the industry. I think climate disclosures are maybe 10 years behind that in opening that door. But that's the same thing as the supply chain resilience. Rather than from a bottom-up site-specific approach to shared interest, this is a top-down, systems-level way of looking at where are the holes in the Swiss cheese that are affecting everybody, not just my company. And you will never see that just looking at your own balance sheet. And so I think that's the upside to disclosure that I think folks haven't really wrapped their heads around yet. And I'm really excited about it as both a design and a financing problem.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you. Look, I could keep talking to you for a long time, but we cannot. So look, please, I'm sure that those that have been watching this want to find out more about your work. So how would they do that?
Oh, please come find me on LinkedIn. So I am always happy to connect there, and come contact our team at precollective.org.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed that, and look forward to catching up with you in person soon.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks for having me.